a second wow. I'm now going to have the pleasure to introduce to you one of the most energetic women that I've met in a long time. She has inspired me to keep going on days when it was kind of hard to see the end of the tunnel coming. She's put together a really wonderful Albany rally in October that I know some of you here went on the bus. We came back tired, we came back energized, and we came back believing we could. So with that kind of an inspiration, and she did this you know, with fairly short notice. Just a little background on Karen. She is an attorney. She grew up in the Catskills area. She is the executive director of the New York State Petroleum Institute, which is a division of the American Institute, or the American API. She has been very active in managing her own farm. In addition to that, she's played legal roles in government. She is general counsel for the industrial port on the Hudson River. She has produced, and I certainly encourage you to pick them up if there's any left, two short videos. One is called The Empire Divide. Again, it tells the story somewhat of Bradford County. And then there's The Women of the Shale, which I'm sure she'll be introduced later. We got one of the stars of The Energy of the Shale, The Women of the Shale, excuse me. Karen's extended lifelong commitment to defending landowners' rights, and defending what we all believe in, and that is the ability for the United States to be successful if we all pull together. It's my great pleasure to introduce our third speaker of the evening, Karen Moreau.
Thanks, Bob. Wow. Well, I was pleased to listen to the two speakers who came before me. They said so many things that were on my mind. I really appreciated the Pledge of Allegiance, something that you know, we take for granted. Hazel Brandt, sitting right up front, some of you might know her. I got to know her in the last year or so. Because one of the great things about being involved in this battle, and it has been a battle, is the people that I've met in the Southern Tier, Hazel being one of them. We made a film last year called The Silent No More, and this is Voices of the Women of the Shale. A young filmmaker, Aaron Price, who's made another film out here, Gas Odyssey, and I worked on this together, and we interviewed 6 women from the Southern Tier, Hazel being one of them. And she's right here in the front row. I'm not going to ask her to stand up because, you know, it's a little challenging sometimes. But people like Hazel really inspire me. She has quite a story. There are so many stories out here of really decent people who have been fighting for now 4 years or more for their development rights. I first got involved in this whole issue probably 2.5 years ago because I had become friends with farmers in Tioga County back in 2001. And at that time, I was counsel for agriculture for the New York State Senate. And farmers come to Albany every year in March for Farm Bureau Lobby Days, and they came in and they were telling me about the challenges they faced in Tioga County in the dairy industry. And they invited me to come out and see firsthand what their farms were like. And that's what brought me out to the Southern Tier for the first time really in my life. And I spent time on their dairy farms with them and came back many times to visit with them. And you know, time rolled forward, and I think it was 2009 or so, when one of those farmers invited me to come to a rally in Albany protesting the moratorium that Governor Patterson had imposed on this region. And I sat there in the front row listening to the speakers, and then I started to really want to know more about what was happening, and that one of those farmers from Tioga County had shut his farm down, and he was driving a water truck in Pennsylvania. And so I ended up going into Bradford County with him and traveling on the roads with him. You know, he was driving a water truck, so he knew where all the sites were. And they're not easy to find. You know, the well drilling sites, to my surprise, were in very remote locations. You had to really look for them, and he knew where they were. And so I traveled with him and ultimately ended up going into Towanda and going to the headquarters of Chesapeake. I walked in with my farmer friend, and I basically said, I really want to talk to somebody who's in the, you know, who deals with the public, media relations, community relations, whatever. Because I'm from upstate New York and I'm from the Albany area, and people either don't know anything in Albany about what's happening and what this is all about, or what they do know is basically fabrication. They're not getting the right information. And I said, there's such a great story to be told, and I could see it in front of me, unfolding before my eyes. I said, and nobody's really getting that message out. And why isn't the industry out there where it really matters a lot? And that's in Albany. You know, in Albany, where the capital is and where all the politicians are, and where a lot of the media focused on state politics is, really weren't learning anything except a lot of negative information. And so that's kind of what brought me into this whole thing, and I ended up getting to know people at Chesapeake really well, and I asked to go on drilling sites and fracking sites so I could really see firsthand how this worked. And I went on a number of tours, and then I ended up doing things like writing about it. So I wrote a number of op-ed pieces for the New York Post about how hydraulic fracturing works, A Tale of Two States comparing Pennsylvania and New York, and talking about, from the point of view of the people on the ground in the communities in Pennsylvania, comparing with the experiences of the people in the Southern Tier who have been deprived of opportunity. And then ultimately made a film about it called The Empire State Divide, and there's a DVD up there. Because as I was doing all this traveling, I was almost like traveling through the last 30 years of my life, and unfortunately, and this is similar to Matt's experience, what I have seen in upstate New York and rural New York has been such a decline as a result of the loss of industry, coupled with the loss of agriculture, and those two things go together in my view. You cannot have a healthy community without having a balance in your community. And you need industry, and you need agriculture, and you need all those other things that really revolve around a production economy. And what I saw in my adult life is just the loss of this in the Hudson Valley where I grew up, because of the cement companies that were really the cornerstone of our local economy. 3 cement plants on the Hudson River, thriving, 1,000 people working. I grew up in a community with a strong middle class. And almost everybody, you know, had the same work ethic, and people had good, solid jobs, and they made decent money, and they had opportunity, and families and generations were able to continue living there. But as I grew older and I saw what happened in the Hudson Valley with the environmental regulation gone haywire, and the growth of the environmental movement really in the Hudson Valley, with the Riverkeeper and the Scenic Hudson and these groups, they really started to move up the valley, and you had this clash of an urban, wealthy, second home population moving up into the valley, who then began to tell the people living there what they could and couldn't do with their property. And ultimately, the people that were across the river from our family's farm did not want to see smokestacks for the cement plants, which were right in our backyard. They did not want to see piles of gypsum and bauxite on the docks. This is across the river. And ultimately, through a host of reasons, and then the global economy, which factors in, these plants all shut down. And now what my small town looks like is few farms left. My family is the last mushroom farm left in New York State. It's a big farm right on the Hudson River, but they're the last ones. And churches with steeples falling down and boarded up synagogues, and the loss of the civic groups that once were the fabric of the community, and most tragically, the loss of the next generation. And so in seeing what has happened in the Southern Tier, to me, it all fits one big picture of what's happened to rural New York. However, what I saw in Pennsylvania was so enlightening and inspiring, and gave me such hope for people I knew in the Southern Tier who were struggling on their farms. And these communities that I saw that were kind of wearing around the edges, but still had a really strong heart. And not only for this part of the state, but in thinking through what this can mean and what this will mean for the rest of New York State. Because the beautiful miracle that is the location of this resource beneath your feet will completely transform this part of the state, and that transformation will weave its way through the rest of our state. As long as there's the political will of the governor to see that and to make it happen. Now, my presentation tonight actually is something that we have put together at the American Petroleum Institute, and let me just explain why I'm there. I ended up representing landowners and farmers fighting for their rights, for the development rights, and actually going before some of these town boards that were trying to ban development in central New York. And I ultimately went to API in Washington and said, you know, we really need to do more in New York to help the landowners and get the message out, because there's like a David and Goliath scene there unfolding, and unlike what the anti-frackers portray this as, you know, where they try to make it seem like they're David and the oil industry is the Goliath. It's just hilarious to me, that characterization. The reality is that the landowners, because of the numbers, and frankly, when it comes to your property rights, very often you are in the minority. And let's remember that the thing that is supposed to protect your rights is the Constitution. I mean, we're a republic, and that Bill of Rights and the Fifth Amendment and about taking of property, that's where the protection is supposed to be. Because landowners, people who own land, are always going to be in the minority. And it's very important that we speak in those terms, always reminding people wherever you are, in front of town boards, in front of government officials, where you have people that are politicians that simply want to respond to polling, you have to say, wait a minute. This isn't a numbers game. These are my property rights, guaranteed by the Constitution, and your duty and your oath is to uphold that Constitution. Every public official takes that oath, whether on the town board or the county or the governor. they have to be reminded of that. And the people in this room, the landowners, are the ones that are in the best position to do that. So I say to you, you need to constantly remember that piece of this whole thing. And you need to communicate that in whatever words you have to say it. Doesn't have to be fancy language, it doesn't have to be long written, letters, but real simple. So I ended up at API because I felt more needed to be done, and they basically said, you want the job. So here I am. So for the last 14 months, I've been working as head of the New York office of American Petroleum and of the American Petroleum Institute. And it's a national trade association representing over 500 companies in the whole chain of oil and gas development. And it really has been quite the experience. I never really thought much about energy before. I just sort of took it for granted. When something is done so well, you do take it for granted. It's so invisible. We turn on a light switch, we don't think anything of it. We get in our car and we drive down the road. We have that freedom, the mobility made possible by fuel. These kinds of things we take for granted. But really, when it comes right down to it, there's a few things really that you can't live without. And that is obviously farms, but also you can't live without mineral development. And low-cost energy is a key to every person's success in life, their ability as families to prosper, and for entire societies to have a quality of life that we become accustomed to. And it has so much to do with the ability to deliver low-cost energy. And it actually really starts with the landowner, and it starts with the mineral rights. Because you may not know this, but we're one of the few countries in the world where our mineral rights are privately owned. That's really significant. They're not owned by the government, except of course if they're on state land or government land. And that's another thing I really feel I need to suggest to you, to be vigilant in this fight. As tough as it is, and as wearing as it is, and as hopeless at times as it seems whenever another delay occurs, I do believe very strongly ultimately you're going to prevail. There's people out there who cannot wait for you to throw in the towel. They cannot wait for you to give up and let somebody else come in and take your property rights. And maybe that somebody is even government. With over 2,000 tax foreclosures pending in Steuben County, what does that mean? So I encourage you to do whatever you can to find it within yourselves and within your family structure to continue to be strong in this fight, because I do believe sometimes the last mile is the hardest. And I know at times, like when we have the rally in Albany, I would call people and say, you've got to come to Albany because the anti-frackers were here a month ago in droves, and these politicians who are lily livers, they respond to these noisy, obnoxious, aggressive people. And they respond to these numbers. And I know you all have real jobs, and you have real things to do, but it's so important to be here. And thank God, your coalition and other coalitions across the Southern Tier came together in October and came to Albany, 1,000 strong, and marched up that street to the Capitol. And you were heard. Maybe they didn't act when we hoped they would, when we said, lift the moratorium now. That didn't happen. but you were heard. And we're going to do whatever it takes, and I will be there with you to do whatever it takes to make sure you're heard. Because what you are fighting for here, I understand it. You know, I have 5 children, 2 of whom are living out of the state right now. And I really can't encourage them to come back here until this state is in better shape and there's opportunity for them. And you have children and grandchildren that you want to see come back here. Because what has happened from this delay and the loss of opportunity is it's fractured families. And that is the thing that is the biggest loss of this whole issue in my view. Because without the family working together in a family structure and that next generation right here in front of you that motivates you and that is the lifeblood of your community, without that, nothing else really matters. Not in my view. And I'm one of 9 kids, and I know what that's about. So, one of the things that I wanted to, I wanted to speak to you tonight, obviously, Bob's invitation about just the general sense of things, but also we have a presentation that I'm going to kind of go through fairly quickly because I don't normally do PowerPoints and they get a little, after a while, a little tedious. But this is something we're working on at API because the next step here, once the green light happens in our communities across the southern tier, the next step is going to involve a lot of community involvement. There's going to have to be communication. There's going to have between the companies, local officials, the citizenry, landowners, everybody who's involved in this process. And one thing we do at API has been around for so many years, and they develop all the standards for the oil and gas industry from an engineering point of view. Best practices for hydraulic fracturing, best practices for water management, best practices for every aspect of development. Well, what we're working on right now is best practices for community involvement with respect to shale gas development. So this PowerPoint is a little bit about that. It also gives you some perspective on just energy, it puts into perspective this whole issue with respect to water usage, energy development, and where we fit in on a global level. I'm not going to get bogged down in numbers, and I may move pretty quickly through this. And then I'll wrap up. Okay, thanks. So let's talk about why our shale resources are important for our future and what's really happening in our industry to promote safety. Matt touched on this quite a bit, so I'm not going to get into that. Go ahead. And this just gives you a map of where all the shale resources are right now. You can see up in our corner of the world a significant shale play, not only the Marcellus, but the Utica. These are very deep shales and hard shales. A little bit of history. Some of you have lived through all this, but I certainly lived through the 70s. And look at what's happened since then. Think about how not too long ago we were paralyzed as a nation. We were paralyzed by the fear that we were running out of oil and we were running out of gas, and what were we going to do? That is gone. That mentality of paralysis has dissipated because of American innovation and entrepreneurial investment. Matt really touched a lot on this, and I love listening to people that are true wildcatters, go out there and just do it. That's what this country was what made America great, and still makes America great today. People willing to take a chance and to go for it. But anyway, because of the technology, this is where we are today. And who benefits? Now, when people love to say things like, oh, big oil. You know, the environmentalists love to use that term. Well, you're big oil. We don't believe anything you have to say anyway. Well, sorry, you're big oil too. Because anybody that owns stock in this country, or anybody that has a retirement or a pension, is big oil and gas, because you're invested. We talk about jobs. There's another thing I hear from the enviros. Jobs, what jobs? Oh, those job numbers, they're make-believe. And by the way, we, the professors of the world, we're the good jobs, by the way, and we don't want those people around. That one really cracks me up. Listening to Sandra Steingraber testify before the assembly a year ago, and the assembly Democrats fawning all over her as she hands them a loaf of organic bread. As I'm watching this, I'm going, this is actually before I took the job. This is when I was just representing landowners, and I'm listening to her say things like, well, in Ithaca, where I live, all my friends are talking about moving. If the gas industry comes here, we're going to have to leave. And you know, we're the good jobs. Well, I was just on a fracking site in Bradford County, and I was in a trailer with 4 or 5 fracking consultants, and this one fellow from Texas, Hispanic fellow, Rael Rodriguez, was telling me how they had just bought a house in Vestal because they were moving here, and his wife was really upset because there's no Neiman Marcus. And I said, so Rael, your wife must like really expensive stuff. How much do you make? $400,000 a year. And the young engineers in the trailer, who were from different parts of the country, were in the 300s, and the people that were not engineers, didn't even have engineering degrees, were making in the high 100s. These are fracking crews. So, to Ms. Steingraber, I say, let's have some of those jobs here, and you guys can leave. And let's have some people that work with their hands here that actually are contributing to this community and are making energy and get up and work ungodly hours in all kinds of hot and cold weather so you can turn the lights on in your classroom and deliver more false information to your students and the rest of the world. Thank you. So, jobs. 2012, 1.8 million jobs in this country from shale energy development. Average hourly pay, $35.15. When I was doing my interviews, I interviewed young guys from Pennsylvania who were on the fracking crews and actually drilling sites and the drilling teams, really. And 2 of them were in my film, 2 cousins, Corey and Brandon Mesco. And they had just come out of college. They had gone to like 2-year schools, and had just come out of college in 2009 when the big collapse, financial collapse happened. And they just had no work, and a lot of their friends had left Pennsylvania because they had no opportunity. And they heard about the opportunity on the drilling rigs. So they went and applied for a job, got a job. They were working for a contractor that was on a Chesapeake rig. And they got trained. At that time, they were training workers down, either in Oklahoma or down south. Now, since then, Pennsylvania has actually built training facilities because of the fact that this is here to stay in the Northeast. You know, this is happening in Pennsylvania and it will happen in New York. And so we are looking at an entire new economy and an entirely new education system for our young people, potentially. So these two young men who are 24 years old were telling me what this meant to them. They were making $79,000 a year. They were working basically 6 months a year because they worked 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off. And I said, all right, so where do you guys see yourself in a year or so? Well, one of them said, I think I'm going to just stick with the industry and work my way up. The other one said, I want to save my money and go to college. Okay, so they had been working for 18 months. One of them had paid off his college debt, $40,000, bought a new car, and this is what really struck me. He said, now I can think about saving for a house, and now I can think about having a family. How many young people around here can think that way? They don't think that way because they don't have opportunity. And think about that for a second. I didn't have to think that way 30 years ago. I never felt that way, like there wasn't opportunity. I really felt like, you know what, if you work hard and you go to school or whatever you do, you're going to have a chance. And these things just, this is the normal progression. But I can tell you, because I have daughters who are 29 and 27 and 24, and I know their friends, and I know their peers. We have a lost generation in this state. And it comes from having no hope. And how many young people this high around here are growing up in communities where they've never known prosperity? What happens to the mindset of a young person in that environment? That is tragic, that is unnecessary, and that can all be turned around by this tremendous phenomenon. For all those people out there that say, you know, we need wind and solar and the hell with oil and gas, and you know, we're organic farmers and we don't want to see fracking, and we drive our Prius around, and you know, we do all that cool stuff that's politically correct and gets us into the finest cocktail parties. I say, you are freaking hypocrites. Because look at this. Every single thing you do and touch and sit on in this world, just about, is a product of almost a lot of it's from petroleum. It truly is. As one wise old miner told me one day, he was from Australia, I met this guy, everything is mined or farmed. Everything, really, that we have. Ultimately, that's where it comes from. Everything is mined or farmed. And when you really think about it, it's pretty much true. So, you know more than anybody about hearsay versus fact, so we can skip that. I think it's important, again, as we go forward, and we work, and I'm working a lot with groups, organizations, and we'll be working with local governments, and we're planning on opening an outreach office in Windsor for the purpose of setting up a place where we can meet with people from the communities and give out information and factual help, and also support landowners groups who need help. It's important for people to have the definitions, but you can see those. This issue has divided communities. You know, it's sort of like people that say, you either, you know, you're greedy because you want to develop your mineral rights and you don't care about anybody else, and I have property rights too, and bottom line is, the truth of it is, as Matt talked about, everybody has the same, really the same goals, the same values, because you live here. You know, the environment, opportunity, and the health of a community. And the health of a community, to me, is more than what these people are promoting in these health reviews and health studies, and these, basically, they're just, you know, attempting to drive the government down into a rabbit hole in search of things you can never find anyway. The bottom line is, they really wanted to look at health. They would go to the most heavily developed oil fields in the country, and where they have decades now of development experience, and can show how human health has, the quality of life and human health has increased because of wealth. Wealth is what allows people to have quality of life, to have access to health care, to live better, to live in a more healthy lifestyle. That's why the latest and greatest delay that we're experiencing right now about the Commissioner of Health running down to EPA and running to Pennsylvania to look at so-called health studies, 2 of which haven't even been started yet, and the EPA one, which is ongoing, will do nothing to indicate anything about health impact from shale development. Absolutely nothing. So I don't know the answer to why they're doing it, but we'll soon find out. And this is all about our unregulated industry. Look at that. We are so unregulated. Could someone please give us some more regulation? You know, this reminds me of when I was working as counsel for agriculture. And the legislators and regulators who were trying to impose more regulation on farmers love to say things like, you know, in New York, if we impose more regulation, that's going to help our farmers because everybody will want to buy their products because they'll know that they have been the most regulated. Okay. So when I'm in Tioga County and I'm on a dairy farm, and in Tioga County, the hills are all like this, okay, and cows are up there, and everybody knows water rolls downhill. And what is going to happen to those farmers when manure is running downhill and into a ditch, and then ultimately, you know, somebody complains? Then they have a $10,000 fine. I mean, it's ridiculous. And what's even worse about this part of the world is that all those farms in New York who had to put in containment systems and expensive barnyard management of waste, all the contractors are coming from Pennsylvania. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But you see the stupidity of government, and the fact is that we have less farms than ever, and now we have an opportunity beyond belief for farms to be reborn because they're going to have wealth and capital to invest, and they're going to be able to diversify their operations and maybe not have to just do one thing, and maybe they can take a day off a week. I interviewed farmers in Tioga County and said, you know, you've got natural gas on your property, what are you going to do next? These 2 brothers, they were so cute, and they're like, well, we might take a day off. I'm like, oh my God. I'm putting this in the New York Post. People will never get that. Change. An argument for state regulation over federal, very simple. You need regulation that relates to the geologic formation that you're in, and you need it to relate to the locality. And the state is the place for that. These are examples of all the permits. This is a list of all the permits you have to get to drill in Pennsylvania. And believe me, the ones proposed for New York are at least that many. we've done an estimate on how long it will take to get a drilling permit, 6 to 8 months, just to go through all of the requirements. Again, we work on standards. We're always looking for better ways of doing things, because that's the beauty of the private sector. You know, the goal is do it better, market a better product, and this has resulted in greener completions, resulted in development of frac fluids that are better techniques for well construction, better techniques for wastewater management, such as closed-loop systems and recycling, which most companies are doing, and for the most part will be required in New York. So this is actually going to end up being a very highly regulated process, but also very environmentally responsible and very environmentally friendly. This gives you a timeline. When you think about this, all of the crazy rhetoric about development impact, and you look at really how long this takes, it's 3 to 5 years for companies to really, you know, be studying the area and figuring out and evaluating and testing. 12 to 18 months for permitting, 2 months really for drilling, putting in numerous wells on a well pad, 2 months. And actually, it's even becoming shorter with improved technology. The actual fracking process, 3 to 5 days. So all of the focus on fracking, trucks coming in with water, etc. 3 to 5 days of activity. For 20 to 30 years of a resource. That's the trade-off. No other form of energy development is that low impact in my view. Not just in my view, in what is reality. Keep going. You can keep going. A lot of this is repetitive, but I like this slide, okay? This compares different forms of energy development. How many acres of land is needed to produce the fuel? For enough electricity for 1,000 households per year. Natural gas is by far the least. When you're talking about land use, and this is the fundamental issue in these towns when it comes to moratoriums, is the land use issues. Compare the footprint of natural gas development. Natural gas, coal, biomass, nuclear, wind, and solar. And I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see this. The biggest challenge I think I have is people that do not want to see how this really works. And you know that someone is not an honest broker when you go to them as a local official or a politician, you say, come down to Pennsylvania and go on these tours and see how it works, and they say, and they don't go. Because then you know they're not interested in the truth. This just talks about water recycling, and by now most companies in Pennsylvania are recycling their water and reusing it on the next well site. This talks about Pennsylvania water usage and comparing shale energy development to all other forms of water use. I think this is a pretty telling piece of information. Again, well construction, that's critical to the success and the safety of this whole thing. And the statistics on this tell the story. Matt pointed out the numbers of wells that have been drilled in this country. In New York State, there's over 14,000 active gas wells right now, all of which have been fractured. without a single incident of groundwater contamination. This talks a little bit about flaring. That's something that you hear the enviros scream about. They don't really understand, well, some of them do, but what flaring is and how it's necessary at times. But again, this is another example of where technology is being developed to reduce flaring. Because companies don't want to lose methane. They don't want to lose the gas. It's not in their best interest to do that. This gives sort of a visual of what a hydraulic fracturing site looks like. I always describe it as like a big truck stop. You know, lots of trucks back up to the wellheads. You know, you've got pump generator trucks, you've got pumper trucks, you've got chemical mixer trucks. They all back up, they do their thing, and then they're gone in 3 to 5 days. Again, you know all about this already. This talks about just really what happens on site. But this product here, that we've developed, is what we plan on doing with this PowerPoint is using this as a teaching tool across the southern tier for all kinds of groups, so they understand this. This talks about what's in fracking fluid, and by the way, it's actually mandated full disclosure under DEC's rules. So if anybody tries to tell you they don't disclose this, that's a lie. But it's really interesting. I was listening to a radio show in Albany today, and there was a congressman from upstate New York, not from this area, but he was saying, oh, they don't disclose the fluid. You know, again, wrong. Seismicity, this is another thing that the activists like to talk about, earthquakes. First of all, they mix up apples and oranges. The only incident where there was some seismic activity that you may have heard about in Ohio they did not involve gas wells that had been fracked. They involved what we call deep injection wells. These are wells in Ohio that are drilled they're very deep wells, and they're used as depositories for industrial waste. You know, we have all kinds of factories in this country that produce all kinds of things that we need to live, including food, chemicals, and all kinds of stuff. And when there's waste, they have to put it somewhere. And now those injection wells are a place where they put waste. And there was some seismicity as a result of that, but nothing significant. Again, not from fracking. You could keep going. These are the things we all want. And basically, this is how, this is how we're going to move this issue forward in this area, but not only this area, but across the country. So I think that's it. But just so you know what's happening right now, New York, we're actually, Cuomo is really going to find himself in a corner. And what I mean by that is not, necessarily between the environmental groups versus the pro-development people. He is going to find himself the Lone Ranger in the United States. North Carolina is about to lift their moratorium on hydraulic fracturing. Illinois is about to lift their moratorium on high-volume hydraulic fracturing. Think about that, Illinois. Home of President Obama, Chicago. I mean, New York, from a political standpoint, is going to very soon be the last state to just be doing nothing. And with the president coming out in the State of the Union with statements supporting oil and gas exploration, development, domestic energy development. Again, as Matt pointed out, we still have the president saying one thing and then other people doing another when it comes to actually doing what it takes. But from a political standpoint, every prominent Democrat, just about, has come out in support of this nationally. Former Governor Ed Rendell, big proponent of this. So I really do believe that this is going to happen, and I do believe it's going to happen probably, it's going to happen slowly, just organically. It will be a fairly slow rollout, but it is going to happen. And it's going to be a very happy day, but I will say that happy day when green light number 1 comes is going to be somewhat momentary, because the fight is going to happen on the local level. And that's why it's so important that we actually start planning for strengthening our towns and educating our local officials to be ready to protect their communities from the denial of opportunity. Because that's what the fight is really about. So, I thank you for your attention.